the next speaker. Next speaker is Cyril Pernet from Copenhagen in Denmark, and he will be talking about public neuro. If we could have his slides up, please.
Okay, thank you. I'm very excited to talk about public neuro, which we launched a couple of months ago. And I would like to thank OHBM and also my founders, Novo Nordisk. So we start by some motivation. So in Europe, we have GDPR, which is the General Data Protection Regulation. So it's a law which protects citizens against companies, for instance, to reuse their personal data. And that means that we can't upload data in a great place like OpenNeuro. And that motivated me to open that repository. And so we start by defining what are under EU law personal data. So personal data under that law is any type of information which are related to an identified person, so that's kind of obvious, right? That's your name, but also identifiable, directly or indirectly. And that's where what we think and what people in Europe have been thinking about is that brain imaging data are personal data. And that's where the problem comes from. Otherwise, we would just use RUS repository. So example of why we think it's personal data. I'm sure many of you have seen that before. We can re-identify data from structural MRI, right, using GANs and other type of techniques like this. Also, it can be potentially lose some information when we use defacing solutions, such as it could degrade performance. It's not so good if you want to do MEG, source reconstructions, and things like that. Similarly, some people have shown you can re-identify from functional MRI data. More recently, we've seen for type of tracers, you can re-identify from PET data. And also, there's multiple papers that show that there's good discriminability and ability to re-identify from EEG or MEG. And so because we can re-identify, it means that basically brain imagings are personal data because they lead to identify. And under the law, there's also only two types of data. There's only personal or anonymous. There's no such a thing as pseudo-anonymous data. That doesn't exist under EU law. And so if you think about biomedical imaging data, features in the data, right, the face, the ears, and neural fingerprints, for instance, but also the metadata. Typically, we would share age, sex, different clinical profile. So if you think deep phenotyping, all of this can make the data identifiable. And so we know from that type of literature, we can single out individuals. And so again, just as a side note, is that pseudo-anonymization exists, but that's just the process of removing data. So even though I could remove the face or things like this, we can still identify potentially, and that means it remains personal. So now if we agree that personal imaging data, that brain data are personal data, then we need to comply with the regulation. And what the regulation says, and the way it works, is that we have GDPR, which says that within the EU, the personal data, they can be shared, so we can do that. But it also states that the general conditions don't apply to research data, which is great. So it's not the same thing as if you're a private company. We are scientists, and we know that for science, we can share. The important aspect is there's no purpose limitation. So if you have data that you collected for Alzheimer, but it wants to be reapplied for something else, there's no problem whatsoever. Right? And then you can think of the way it works in Europe as a pyramid. We've got, like in the States, the EU law or federal law. Then we've got the state's law, which basically take the EU law and add some little features, not necessarily features you want. Then you got the university who interpret that law, and then each lab has their own way they want to share data. And then we go to what we talked about earlier, which are data user agreements. Each lab has their own way to do things. So how do you implement this? Right? So the idea is that we want to deal with this data user agreement in a completely automated fashion so that Martin next time can do his study in 3 months rather than 24. The way we do that is that we allow diversity of DUAs by design. So as an institution that collects data, you contract us through a service agreement, and so that's a legally binding document. Once we have that agreement in public neuro, then our job is to make sure that people are identified, we control the access, and that people sign those DOA through web forms. So that makes things way easier, and you don't have to go to all of these negotiations and so on. And then, of course, we control the access. We have all sorts of mechanisms to do that. And then, as a user, then you'll be able to download the data. So each data set has their own data user agreement, what are signed before accessing. And what we do is simply allow all combinations of sharing by identifying users. So why do you want to use something like public neuro? And it's not just for European data, right? Some countries like Korea and other countries also need these kind of places. Well, of course, we allow data hosting. So you got accessibility, metadata enhancements, and searchability. So we make the data findable, and we're going to work with OpenNeuro so that some of the metadata can be found as well. And then, of course, there is an unload in terms of administrative burden, because we will manage the data access. We can also do non-EU paperwork. So, for instance, when you're not EU country or adequate, you need to sign some additional contract. But these are standard, so we can handle that automatically. And it can be paper heavy or lightweight, depending if you want to control who signs or who doesn't sign, and all sorts of combinations. Just to finish a little bit on that aspect, is that I introduce an idea of public but not open. So which means that there is a public register of your data, and I think that's the key fact. You want the data to be findable, and people know that the data are there, but we control the access, right? That's the slight difference in the concept of open science. Of course, we have a tight control of the regulation in terms of who can access your data and things like this. And the users are fully identified, and there's always like, they have a time-limited token, but all transactions are recorded because under EU, this has to be audited, so we can track every single user. And of course, we use state-of-the-art security with a data center which is ISO compliant. So the data are secured behind the firewall, and the file systems map the data with different URL, and we are starting to use datasets for people who know this tool. All the data are open, right? That's the idea, is that you can search the data, you can access the metadata. You can't access the data themselves, but all the information about the files and what kind of study it is. And we'll use datasets that serves the data. We use the data catalog, which serves the metadata. And future work and ongoing work allow data to be also findable on OpenNeuro, and the metadata browsable and searchable with NeuroBagel and other tools like this. I would encourage you to come and visit my poster if you want to share some of European data this afternoon. Thank you.
Okay, so we have a couple questions from the audience. The first would be, how does public neuro ensure the continuous control over the shared data by the data controller?
So it's totally flexible. So for instance, in my lab, what we do is we have a DUA where we don't control anymore who has access, because we give data controller rights. So you will come, sign the DUA, and get a token. You can download the data. But we have some people who want to only give data processor right, which means that the person will sign the DOA, that will go to your lab, somebody in your lab will approve it, and then we will give the access token. So we have all sorts of options, because we know that in different countries and different lab, the requirements are different. So there's not one size fits all here, it's very customized.
Great, thanks. So another question is, a question that I had also is, what's your model for sustainability? Will you charge individual groups that want to share data, or is there some sort of fee for service?
Yeah, so so we are a public institution, which means we are not allowed to make money. So sustainability-wise, right, it's tough. So first you have to, so the servers you have to pay for hosting the data, very expensive price of €10 a terabyte per month. So, and a little bit of admin cost. So right now, for instance, we had an agreement with INRIA for 1.5 terabyte over 10 years is about $4,000. So in a grant, $4,000, I don't think it's a big deal. Of course, we have costs, and we need to operate and so on like this. So despite the grant, which pays for all the infrastructure and all of this, there's a little fee to be able to maintain long-term your data, right? So we can guarantee that for 10 years your data are there on the servers because you pay for it. But I mean, right, $10 a terabyte, I think it's pretty cheap.
Okay, thanks very much, Cyril. We'll have the next speaker up.